Hey, my name is PolishLynx and welcome to Narcissu, a Little Iris. 6th episode means 6th chapter. And the title of it is Prayer. Let's begin. It was a beautiful place. The country's beautiful churches stood here and there, and in the morning and evening clear bells would ring out. The clear lake, the grass fields, the spreading white, the flowers that blossomed every season. However, for the people who lived there, we didn't have just that. My father held the title of knight. No, it was probably more correct to say he was a former knight. It was an officially granted title, but it was to a country lord, and even that lord had eventually been replaced. Essentially, it was a title that didn't mean much. But despite that, my former knight of a father would proudly tell stories about it whenever he could. While listening to that, I always thought, the honor of a knight seemed to require very strict qualifications, but seemed to be very lax in examining the character of the person. The reason being, since I could remember, I only had memories of him being a robber or a rebel. Okay. For he did have to feed a family of 6, he seemed to be rude, cowardly, dishonest, a textbook example of an outlaw. Of course, I had no intention of speaking ill of outlaws. If a struggling commoner was going to die anyway, they would become outlaws. They only stole and killed in order to continue living. My father was probably the same as them. One day, as usual, I was made to keep watch outside some mansion. I was still 12 years old, but I was always given these sorts of tasks, so I was used to it. Eventually there were angry shouts from inside the mansion, and then what sounded like the screams of the family members ringing out. He probably killed a number of people again. While my father was an outlaw, he was thorough. Fearing retribution, he always killed everyone within a residence. And after the commotion, my father would emerge covered in blood. The blood was, of course, that of his victims. Next, the usual pattern was making me carry the things from inside the mansion. While thinking that, I waited for my father, who had broken his way inside. Toot! With a dull sound, something fell in front of my eyes. It was dark, so I couldn't tell what it was at first. But I soon realized what it was. My father. More specifically, his head. And at the same time, from inside the mansion I heard laughing voices. The voices were calling it divine punishment, saying he wasn't a knight. And the voices continued, saying to burn his house down and how they should exterminate them. I suddenly didn't know what to do. In the dark I picked up my father's head and ran home in a daze. The small house at the foot of the mountain. I ran for it desperately without pause. And finally arriving home, I quickly opened the door. Hurry and run from here. Sorry, I shouted that with gasping breaths. At first my mother did not know what was happening, but when she saw my father's head in my head, she must have realized what happened. I couldn't fight them, even by mistake. They were probably a band of mercenaries hired by the mansion owner, and here we only had my mother and my 4 siblings. Oh, damn it. I hurriedly took my younger brothers and sisters' hands and made to leave the house. But for some reason my mother made no move to escape. My younger siblings didn't try to move either. Hurry, if we don't go! Despite my urging, my mother and siblings didn't move. Then they put their hands together and started muttering. Saying that, she started praying to a god that apparently existed somewhere, but whom I had never met. Even when doing so, wouldn't do anything. However, ignoring my words, my mother and siblings all continued to pray fervently. Without thinking, I yanked on the hands of my youngest brother and sister. I didn't know what I should do. My mother raised her voice at me, telling me to stop. But I ignored her. It wasn't that I was confused, I was simply desperate. With a burst of belongings, I took just my younger brother and sister and fled from the house. We ran into the mountains, paying no heed to anything else. I ran pulling my younger brother by the hand and carrying my little sister on my back. The only thing in my head was to get as far away as possible. I was so afraid I didn't even dare look back. But eventually I turned back and looked. In the darkness, in the direction of the house, I could see a red point of light. A point because I was so far away. And red, of course, because of the fire. As for what was burning, I didn't even have to think to know the answer. My sister's voice addressed me from my back. A simple question, showing she didn't understand what was going on. It's fine. Don't worry. I answered, then started walking again. Watching the distance, wavering dot as I went. Don't worry. Don't worry. It will be fine. I repeated that over and over, almost like an incantation. I kept saying it to my sister, and I'm sure I was also saying it to myself. It wasn't like we had a place to go or any relatives. Of course, there was nothing backing up my assertion that everything would be fine. A few months after that day, we were living in the mountains. I didn't think anyone was out to kill us anymore, but we still did our best to stay hidden. But we couldn't live here like this forever. It might be fine if I were alone, but it was impossible for my young brother and sister. It was clear they would eventually be overstressed. And as we were about to be reduced to begging, a rumor fell upon my ears. Recruitment. Military service. It was a recruitment for soldiers wishing to go on a campaign. I had heard the word crusade a number of times before. Once, my father had been rejected with a single laugh, but this time it seemed to be declared by the regional lord. And they seemed to especially welcome knights, and I had heard that the church was fully supporting it. What should I do? I didn't even have the room to estate. Even if I didn't know the details, there was no other way. So, taking my young brother and sister by her hand, I headed to the church in town. When I arrived in town, I put on my armor. I brought it with me when I fled my home. It was the first time I'd ever worn it, and it was heavy and far too big for me, but I had no time to complain. I had always been big for my age, but I needed something more to conceal how young I was. When I arrived at the church, I first informed the bishop that I wanted to participate. Of course, I did not forget to show my father's sword. I had been told countless times that it was the proof of knighthood. I lowered my voice and tried to act natural, doing my best to make sure no one discovered I was a child. If I was refused here, we'd become beggars. If that happened, our path through life would disappear. And so I was desperate. And yet, despite all my worries,
騎士の方の参加は大歓迎ですよ。我々も協力を惜しみません。
the bishop said that with a calm smile upon his face. That I now can understand. It probably didn't matter whether I had been officially knighted or not. At least for the minor local lord of this country, joining a campaign was a way of demonstrating fealty. So anyone who called themselves a knight was a knight. Even if it was somewhat known, they probably just wanted a head count and some gilding.
それでは、私の書状とともに合流地へ向かってください。
I told him that in exchange for my signing on, I'd like them to look after my brother and sister until I return from my campaign. Call it anticlimactic if you like, it was, but to me, there was no greater relief. I didn't understand why they treated me like this, and I couldn't imagine what the church wanted. But I was vaguely aware that they had their pride to uphold. If I gave distinguished service, that translated to honor for them. If I died, that was of no concern to them. Having many men join a crusade itself was how a small country raised their position. But that had nothing to do with me. There was no other way to live. I entrusted my siblings to the church and proceeded to obey the bishop's direction. Would I trust my siblings in times like that? I think I wouldn't. I wouldn't probably even fight for church. Well, that's for sure actually. Receiving the letter from the bishop and a small amount of travel money, I headed to the gathering point. It was a faraway land. Of course, it was the first time I'd been to that foreign country. As I was taken to the meeting point, I slowly started seeing more soldiers. Occasionally, I could even see knights. When I showed the bishop's letter, I was placed into a small unit. There, I learned the situation for the first time. Apparently, this was the third campaign. I'd heard from the rumors that it was being referred to as a crusade. Of course, I wasn't even remotely religious. My now dead mother was very devoted, but given how she died, there was no way I'd be a believer. But for some reason, perhaps the bishop's letter of introduction, I wasn't treated at all poorly. I guess it was because the ones joining in the middle were mostly commoner soldiers, and there were few knights. Out of necessity, I had to appear as an adult, so I grew my hair out, lowered my voice, and never took off my armor. When we finally reached our destination, I was with dozens of common soldiers and one young deacon. It seemed that he had been on a number of campaigns already. He especially didn't have any questions for me and seemed used to things. However, his eyes were darkly clouded. Perhaps he had killed many people. His eyes were like my father's, the dark eyes of a killer. From here, we joined an even larger group and we entered the large city that was our destination. At first, since I had been told it was a crusade, I was wondering what sorts of things we would be made to do. But the mission we were given wasn't difficult. Extermination, even if they were Byzantines, that was all there was to it. Eventually, as we proceeded exactly in that way, I saw a ghastly sight. There were those running in confusion and those chasing and killing. Those who broke into houses, killed and defiled the family, taking the gold and silver. There were also those who would set fires indiscriminately. This was a holy war. Truth is stranger than fiction. Those words popped into my head suddenly. And here there weren't any enemy soldiers facing us. From the rumors, there weren't any heretics either. More importantly, we were attacking a Christian church. Yep, that's how church worked. To be frank, at first I was mostly surprised. But despite not knowing the reason we were advancing, I wasn't that troubled. It wasn't a very difficult thing. We simply had to kill. We simply had to take. That's how I interpreted things, and it probably wasn't that far off. Besides, I was big for a child, and there was no real battle going on. No resisting, just fleeing. Someone was begging for their life as I was pointing my sword at them. Gold coins. As he spoke, he showed me 2 gold coins he had been gripping in his hand. I hadn't seen them before, but they were probably real ones from before this era. With that much gold, my young brother and sister won't become beggars, and I wouldn't have to become a killer. I instinctively thought that, but the soldier next to me cut him down. There was neither hesitation nor mercy in that single blow. Yeah, I know. I replied with that, but it wasn't like I wasn't unsettled. Should I kill someone so easily? However, in stark contrast to my thoughts, the killer himself picked up the bloodstained coins without hesitation. I can take it. Eh? He spat those words at me, then hurried to the upper floors. Soon I heard a young woman scream, but it only lasted a few moments. Then quickly it was silenced. I'm sure that the only ones to walk out of this building alive were us, and I'm sure it was much the same elsewhere. And even when we went out onto the street, the horrific sights didn't end. The streets were littered with motionless bodies and burning houses and churches. Occasionally there were those who had their hands together in some kind of prayer. But those people were not saved, and there were no people to save them. Their heads would be casually chopped off, and the rosaries in their hands would fall to the ground and become soaked in blood. The thing that they clung to, prayed to, was probably better cold-hearted. Or perhaps it had meaning that men like us couldn't even guess at. Here, faith was useless. You could only believe in what you could see with your own eyes. I told myself that forcefully. And then, a few days later, when the city's streets were mostly covered in blood and had turned to ashes, we made to leave the place. Most likely, they were brought down pillaging. They seemed to be eager to move on to someplace new. In the midst of that, I was dealing with someone who'd waited too long to run away. Words that I've already heard countless times these past few days. I didn't need to listen to his words any further. Without hesitation, I brought my sword down. I didn't need to think about it, I just had to kill and then take. Silently, I picked up the silver coins. It hadn't been decided officially, but it was generally accepted that we could take anything they had been carrying. Of course, amongst us there were probably those who joined the crusade in the name of gods. But most were after this. They didn't care about any lofty ideas. They were simple looters and killers. The crusade was nothing more to them than a public excuse. However, there was a severe punishment for letting the enemy escape. If we were discovered, we ourselves would be in dangerous position. If things didn't go well, I heard that we might be executed. Sorry, I don't have any reason to hate you, but I muttered to some stranger that had already stopped breathing. At that time, somewhere, something hurt, felt painful. Though I personally didn't have the slightest of injuries, for some reason it felt like I was covered in blood. And like this, I went to the next battlefield. I had no idea how much longer this journey of killing would continue. Because I didn't know if living in the middle of was allowed, I followed the army the whole time. However, the pain that came after killing people was fading. Or more precisely, I was growing numb to it. And then I realized that I, too, had dark eyes now. The hearts of men are fragile things. And that might be exactly why there was a need to armor it. A few months afterwards, we were still advancing. It was the weak voice of some soldier. Since he had injured his leg in the previous day's battle, it seemed it was all he could do to keep up with the advance. About what? Yeah, of course not, because it's not a holy crusade, okay? It's a shitty crusade. He said this quietly, looking at his leg. Maybe, but you know now, right? That was all I replied with. I couldn't think of any other words to say. The both of us. No, everyone had killed countless people, for there were those who plundered as much as they could. Being left behind in this land meant dying. So he, too, stood on the border between life and death here. Sorry, but I'm not a doctor. And clasping his hands together, the soldier started offering prayer. Closing his dark eyes and shedding tears, his earnestly praying form was already no longer that of a killer. And despite that, I just watched him in the days. To me, he was already a dead man. Here I knew that faith was useless. Here I learned that being almost dead was the same as death. There were countless roads leading to death. But for me to continue living, there was only this. Especially since if I didn't earn, my family starved. If I died, my family dies. For some reason, I recalled my father, who had always been called a bandit. I remembered the dark-eyed killer. I wonder if my sister is doing well. Suddenly I recalled the sister I left in my country. I recalled the young sister who cried herself to sleep on my back. I murmured, looking up at the dark night sky. If I were unlucky, my morning it might even accumulate. In this weather, the moon probably won't be coming out for a while. While thinking about that, my thoughts drifted to the girl I'd left behind not long ago. How about you move your ass back? Come morning, she'd be caught and then killed. so there was no chance of us meeting again. There was nothing to feel bad about. In my head, I understood that. But for some reason, my footsteps were heavy. I could think of one reason. Unless I saw her dead with my own eyes, I probably wouldn't be at ease. And when she was caught, she might say something to the soldiers, which meant that there could be harm to me.
よし。引き返そう。
With that whisper, I reversed my path. That's right, it's not like I was going to save her. This was just on a whim. All things considered, I was turning back for my own sake. To get rid of any concerns, I'd go back and kill her with my own hands. Even to me, it felt like a pathetic excuse. But I couldn't let there be any more other reason. For someone who knew nothing other than killing, I was not allowed to have any other reason.
それが暗い目をした者の心に穴の開いた者の運命なのだから。
My mouth spoke those words, but my feet kept increasing their pace. I thought the moon hidden behind the clouds might still come out. Did I really turn back to kill her? It was a question that bubbled up within me constantly. As I ran, I kept telling myself forcefully that yes, I did. And yet, somewhere in my heart, I hoped she was safe. Even I realized I wasn't acting like myself.
あなた
Seeing me, her face showed surprise. Apparently she hadn't moved. And for some reason, mood was smeared on her twisted ankle as well as some spots that appeared to be bruised.
その泥は何の真似だ。
どうして帰ってきたの？
俺は何の真似だと問うている。
これは湿布のようなもので足を冷やす効果があるのよ。
そうか。便利なものだが。
I crouched down and faced away from her as I answered.
ほら、早くおぶされ。
え？
さっきは力になれないと。
今はある。ただし、気まぐれだから早くしろ。
これでいいの？
いや、ダメだ。もっと首に手を回せ。
え？
わかった。
I put her onto my back and ran. She was light as a feather, so it was much different from me running unburdened. The wave I could feel my back was her everything. In the snow, the warmth from our touching bodies was heart-wrenching and sad.
ねえ、腕が疲れない？
平気だ。それより、またかけるからしっかり捕まっていろ。
Occasionally, a worried voice would speak up from behind me. I was starting to realize that this was the first time she'd ever been carried. Meanwhile, I was quite used to carrying someone. Her wave wasn't as light as this.
なんださっきから。
その、ありがとう。
She said that quietly, rubbing her cheek against my back. I couldn't see her expression, but my back felt hot.
らしくないから、礼など言うな。
そうね。らしくなかったわね。
Even now, the falling snow was increasing. The cold wind stripped our body heat away mercilessly and got in our way. But it hit the moon and erased our footprints. As if lending us a hand, it kept on falling. A killer who's used to carrying, and a killer who's never been carried before. As if it was our only ally in the whole world, the snow kept falling.
ここまで来れば大丈夫だろう。
I stopped a long way from that fort. After coming this far, it was probably fine now. Far enough that even if cavalry were to be sent out, we could run into the mountains to avoid them.
なんとかなったか。
Letting out the breath, I quietly lowered her from my back. However, apparently it was still difficult to walk, for the princess once again sat down on the ground. She took out some more of the mood-like stuff from earlier and started putting it on her leg. I didn't really understand it, but it was probably a method of healing in this country.
なあ、姫様。その泥は効果あるのか？
明日には良くなるはずよ。
なるほど。便利なものだな。
I didn't know where she got the knowledge, nor did I ask. Most likely it was some mystical charm, but an actual remedy.
あなたの国にはないの？
ああ、そんな便利なものはない。
じゃあ、どうやって直すの？
そりゃあ、祈るだけだ。
Heh. Sorry about that, won't help. And then just leave it to chance. That wouldn't work at all. Sorry, man. That's true. That doesn't work. Alright. Let's end it here. Chapter 6 finished. Tomorrow we are going with the next one. So, hope you enjoyed it. And, well, I hope I can see you tomorrow as well. Bye bye.